What's up, everybody? Welcome to Cinema Trip Reviews. I am Wyatt, and today on the show, I'm going to be talking about Salem's Lot. If you haven't already, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Cinema Trip Reviews. Also, drop in and give us a good review wherever you get your podcasts. Helps us get the show out there to a lot of other people. Helps the brand a little bit, and I really appreciate it. So today on the show, I'm going to be talking about Salem's Lot. This movie has been in production for quite a while now. I believe it started in like 2020 or 2021. There's been a lot of debate whether they're actually going to put it on a streaming or if they're going to release it in the theaters. Guess it doesn't seem like they had enough confidence in the movie itself, so they decided to throw it straight on the Max. Just released over the weekend. As far as Salem's Lot goes, it is based off of the Stephen King book from back in the day. They had the miniseries, I believe it was on like CBS or NBC or something like that, two-part miniseries of Salem's Lot, directed by Tobe Hooper. Guy directed Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Poltergeist, The Funhouse, amongst other things. He's a fantastic director. I did see the original Salem's Lot that he made in '79. I believe I only seen it like once. It is a 3-hour long movie. I just didn't have the time to go back and revisit it before watching this flick, though, unfortunately. But I do remember liking it. I do remember it being very slow paced. You really get to kind of sit in with the town and get the feel of the town and everybody that lives in it, get a feel for the characters and everything. And I do believe that may be a downfall of this movie, but I'll get into that in a bit. They did have another miniseries. I believe it came out in the mid 2000s. I believe it had Rob Lowe. I didn't never seen anything. I had just heard about it recently, kind of doing a little bit of research for this. Had no idea that existed whatsoever. I only knew of the original, Tobe Hooper one. So, I was kind of excited whenever they announced that this was being made, a couple years back. I didn't really know who was going to be involved with it. All I knew was that HBO may be involved and they may be releasing it on their platform. And I normally have a decent amount of confidence with HBO and their decisions. And seeing the director that was attached, Gary Doberman or Doberman, however you pronounce it. Now, he's only directed these two movies, Annabelle Comes Home and Salem's Lot, but he has a decent amount of writing credits. And when you look at him, you kind of really know what to expect going into Salem's Lot. And, just to kind of name a few, he had the original Annabelle, the spinoff of Conjuring, Annabelle Creation, It Chapter 1, It Chapter 2, the Swamp Thing series, The Nun 2. Been involved with kind of the spinoffs for The Conjuring and those It movies that were kind of popular, especially the first one. It Chapter 2 wasn't as great. And then, of course, he wrote the screenplay for Salem's Lot as well as directing it. Now, seeing those movies that he's written for and the other movie he's directed, I kind of knew what to expect going into this, especially after watching the trailer for this. It seems very in line with those, Conjuring movies or spin-offs of the Conjurings. And my expectation going into this was just going to be kind of another mediocre, by the numbers, horror movie, popcorn movie. And boy, was I right. And there's a decent reason that this movie went straight to HBO Max. And I definitely understand why they didn't go the route of putting it in theaters. That's not to say this movie's bad by any means. It's not a bad or a terrible movie. I've seen a lot of people really hammering this movie and shitting on this movie online, like calling it one of the worst movies of the year. It's one of the worst horror movies of the past couple years. I don't think it's nearly as bad as what all these other folks are saying out there on, social medias and what have you. I just think it was a very mediocre by the numbers movie. I think it was a very good introduction horror movie for younger viewers. Even though this movie was rated R, I feel like this is a very decent introduction horror movie to a lot of younger people that just aren't familiar with horror movies in general and don't really know what to kind of go out and look for first. I think this is very tame compared to a lot of other horror movies you can introduce people to. And it is rated R, but I feel like a lot of the stuff that gives it that R rating is just swearing. It really isn't a lot of gore or anything crazy by any means. It definitely doesn't reach Terrifier levels, but it definitely doesn't go as far as you would think it would go as far as gore or violence. It doesn't really go that far at all with it. There's only a couple scenes with, blood. There isn't really anything too crazy as far as kills or anything like that, which with a rated R horror movie, you kind of expect some of those things. You want to see some cool kills. You want to see a little bit of more, gore in the movies. I like the gore personally within, horror movies and slasher movies or what have you. So, I was already a little disappointed after watching the movie from that. But I think this is a decent introduction horror movie to a lot of people. You can kind of, I'm not going to say it's as good as these movies, but you can kind of lump it in with Poltergeist or Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, or some other, horror movies that really don't push the line as far as gore or craziness. The only thing that really gives it the R rating is just kind of swearing from here and there, just dropping some F bombs. Obviously not kids, but going into like early teens, I think this is a good movie to kind of introduce some people to horror. It doesn't really push the envelope or go too far with it. Now, this movie does star Lewis Pullman as Ben Myers. You got Mackenzie Lee as Susan Norton. Pilu Asbeck, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. I haven't really seen him in too much before other than Game of Thrones. That's the only real thing I know him from. Alfre Woodard, Bill Camp as Matthew Burke. He's one of my favorite characters in the movie. And also Jordan Preston Carter, who plays Mark Petrie. And he was also one of my favorite characters in the movie. I think he's one of the underrated ones in here. Now, for those who aren't familiar with the book by Stephen King or the miniseries, the story follows a couple of main characters. The main one you really follow is Ben Mears, who's a writer who's returning to the town of Salem's Lot. It was originally called Jerusalem's Lot. It's abbreviated Salem's Lot. He originally grew up there, and there was unfortunately a tragedy that happened. He ended up leaving, and all these years later, he's become somewhat of a famous writer, a well-known writer, and he's returning to the town to kind of get his ideas for his next story. And Salem's Lot has a complicated history. There's a huge like mansion up on the hill. They're saying that was haunted. There's been like suicides there and what have you. The town has had a complicated history, along with a lot of other Stephen King's towns that he introduces within his stories. But you mainly follow Ben Mears, played by Lewis Pullman, Jordan Preston Carter's character Mark Petrie, and Matthew Burke, played by Bill Camp. You mainly follow those three throughout the movie. Now, the basic gist, because I don't want to give too much away, obviously, in this review, is Ben Mears is returning to the town to get some ideas for his next story. And you also have some other newcomers to the town. Richard Straker, who runs like this antique shop that is opening up. He's like a British, like fancy pants type dude. Nobody really knows what his deal is, but he bought that mansion on top of the hill that I mentioned has a lot of history behind it. And as you see it at the beginning of the movie, he moves in this big ass box down into the basement and everything. And as you come to find, you see this in the trailer, so it's not a huge spoiler or anything. You see this in the trailers and the promotion. There are vampires involved. He ends up bringing what I can only describe as like a Nosferatu. I mean, he looks very similar to Nosferatu with the bald head, the pointy ears, the long pointed fangs, very creepy, the bright eyes. And that's really what they kind of introduce in this movie as far as the vampires go. And also I don't know if it's in Stephen King's original book, but the original series, the vampires have like glowing yellow eyes, especially at night, which is such a cool effect, especially in the older one. And I think it looks decent here as well. But over the course of the movie, you start having some people start going missing, some people start turning up dead, some people start acting very weird. And the main characters that I mentioned you follow throughout the whole movie, they decide to start investigating, start a little investigizzle into what's going on here. Now, I'm really going to stop there because I don't want to go too far into the story and going into spoilers and what have you like that. This movie is about 2 hours long. The original one, like I mentioned, is like 3 hours. From what I read here, they had an original cut which was 3 hours long, which, man, I can't imagine this movie being extended by another hour, because I feel like they were kind of stretching it at times just for this movie. The acting was somewhat decent for who you had in here. My big problems come with some of the characters in the movie. Like the main character that you follow, Ben Mears, played by Lewis Pullman, he just doesn't have a lot to him. He's just very bland. He doesn't have a lot that sticks out over some other characters. Like Jordan Preston Carter's character, Mark Petrie, he's a younger kid. He's kind of nerdy. He reads his comic books. He has a lot of familiarity with, vampires and monsters. He's very smart. He kind of tinkers with things and builds little contraptions. He has decent amount of character development to him, and he has a decent amount to him that makes you like the character. And he's new to the town as well. You see he's getting bullied in school, but he's able to handle it. He goes back at the bully and fights back because if you keep being scared or running from the bullies, it's going to just make them come after you harder. So he decides to fight back. And it makes you really like this character a little bit more. And even though he's like 11 and a half, like he says in the movie, he's more badass than a lot of these other adults that are in the movie that don't know what the hell they're doing. This kid is badass, and he's one of my favorite characters of the movie, if not my favorite character of the movie. And the other one that I mentioned, the other main character you follow, Matthew Burke, played by Bill Camp, who's also one of my other favorite characters. He plays like a school teacher who ends up like, running in the Mark and, kind of helps him get out of trouble a little bit. But he's one of the ones that kind of first starts the little investigating into what's going on in the town. And he's just very interesting. He just seems like a cool dude who's been living in this town for a while, knows everybody. And he just has a decent reputation. Like he's a good person. And it seems like him and, Mark's character have decent character development. Whereas Ben Mears' character, the main character you're supposed to be following, all you really know about him is he's a writer and that he kind of starts hooking up with this chick that's in town that has the hots for him. He doesn't really have a lot of other stuff going on. He doesn't really have a lot to do. He doesn't have a lot of range as far as characters go. He's just kind of a boring character to have as your main character. Whereas the other two I mentioned, they seem like decent people, seem like decent characters. They didn't really do much for Ben Mears, and maybe that's the point. He's just kind of a boring author who's just kind of going through like a rough patch. I don't know. I just feel like they could have done a little bit more for him to make him more exciting and make you want to follow him around, or just kind of make you care what happens to him throughout the course of the story. Because I kind of genuinely like, you have a little bit of feelings for these other characters in the movie. I'm not going to say all of them. I'm just saying mainly Matthew Burke and Mark Petrie's characters kind of care about what happens to them throughout the whole movie. But all these other characters, because there's a lot of other characters kind of, I wouldn't necessarily follow, but kind of interspliced throughout the movie here and there. You don't really care about them too much. There's really not much development through them. Even Mackenzie Lee's character, Susan, who is hooking up with Ben's character, she doesn't really do much. There's not much to her in the movie. She has a crazy ass bob, this one. I don't know what her hairdresser was thinking, but maybe, hey, it was set in the 70s. Who knows? Now, another nitpick that I have, this is a very good looking movie. That's not my nitpick. It's a very good looking movie as far as the town. It looks very well lived in, but I feel like some of the artsy fartsy choices that they decided to go with as far as the cinematography, using, incorporating certain colors in like these blues or red lighting at certain spots. I feel like it kind of hurts the movie in certain ways. I feel like there should be a lot more darkness throughout the movie. And I don't mean a lot more darkness as in like AVP Requiem, like darkness where you can't see a goddamn thing throughout the whole movie. I just feel like with the subject matter in the movie, as far as vampires and the darkness of the town and what's happening within the town, and they're coming out at night, I feel like they should have utilized darkness a lot more throughout the movie. Case in point, at the very beginning of the movie, you have these two guys that were hired to take this big ass box down into the basement of the mansion that I mentioned. As they're going down into this basement, they don't really have like lighters or candles with them. They're just going throughout the basement, and the whole scene has like this bluish hue to it, and the characters seem like they can kind of see their way around. They often mention like how dark it is, but you as the viewer can see everything perfectly fine. Everything has like a blue hue to it, and you can see everything within the basement as they're walking around. Whereas there's not really any lights in there. It should be completely pitch black. It should be dark in there. They should have to use some sort of light source to kind of see or maneuver their way around this crowded basement. And later in the movie, when certain characters go down in that very same basement with no lights, they make it completely pitch black, and they have to use like a lighter or a candle to maneuver their way around the basement. And just weird that there's certain points that they decide to throw like this weird filter over the movie, and certain points there's not, because there are other points in the movie where they have like this like bluish filter, or like a like a yellowish filter for the daytime or something. And then other points they just have it completely cut out, like when they're indoors or outside in certain circumstances, they just have the filter removed, and you can kind of tell that there's a difference between them. Like if you're going to do kind of the filter thing, do it throughout the whole movie. Don't just pick and choose where you want to do it. And if you want to go with very like dark and ominous and pitch black scenes, why wouldn't you make that throughout the whole movie? Because I think that would have added to the atmosphere and added to the tension and scariness of the movie. It just seems like they couldn't decide what they wanted to do, because they decided to have this weird filter on for certain scenes, and then they remove it for others. And then they want it to be super dark in some scenes, and then in other scenes when it's supposed to be dark, they have that hue so you can see everything else around. I don't know. I wish they would have just picked a route and went with it, because personally, I think if everything was much darker, it would have helped out with the suspense and the atmosphere of the movie, which was severely lacking some. Because as far as a horror movie, there's really not many scares in this. I mean, there's only a couple like decent kind of creepy scenes. Specifically, there's one scene where there's a character that is kind of tied up, and they have like a sack over their head, and they're looking through like this hole, and every now and then you get to see through the hole, and you can see some characters moving around, and then you see that like Count Orlok, that Nosferatu character, slowly walking down these stairs, and it's kind of cutting in and out because of the characters moving. You can only see through the eye hole of the sack that's over his head, and it does a decent job of building tension in that scene, and they just don't do that going forward throughout the rest of the movie. There's not really many any jump scares, if at all, or at least very any effective ones by any means. They don't really go for cheap jump scares, which like in this type of movie, especially with a guy that's been involved with like Conjuring spinoffs and stuff, you kind of expect some cheap jump scares in there, but this movie doesn't really have any. Sadly to say, it doesn't really have many scares at all. It has some creepy scenes, but it's not really scary by any means, which also helps with, being a good introductory horror movie for some younger kids. Now, with that being said, it does have some very interesting and cool shots that are in the movie. I don't know if it was the choice of the director or just the, cinematographer, but it has some very interesting and really cool shots throughout the movie itself. It's just a matter of how they shot it, with the color grading or, the filter. It's just kind of the problem. But they have some really cool creative shots. Specifically, there's one towards the end, and I think it's in one of the trailers, but it's the Nosferatu, Count Orlok type demon standing on top of this building, and there's like a projector from a drive-in, and he's just standing there with the projector behind him blasting, and it's such a fucking cool shot. And I wish we would have got more of that, because without going into spoilers, obviously, some of my issues with the movie are involving the vampires, and specifically the main one, the Nosferatu, the head vampire that's going around creating all these other ones. He's not utilized enough. You only have him cut here and there, and I understand it may not have been like that in the book. He was used very sparingly in the original, Salem's Lot from '79. But I feel like they really didn't utilize him much. And the look of them looks decent in some spots because it looks like they use some practical effects here and there. But you know how it is nowadays. They say they use practical effects and then they'll go over and touch them up with CG, and you can really tell that in certain scenes. And that goes for the rest of the movie. There's a lot of weird CG things that kind of throw you off a little bit, where the practical effects do look cool in a lot of circumstances, certain circumstances where they don't as well. And I mean, some of the weapons they use, specifically the one that Mark the kid used later in the movie, has like this big like stake that's made out of like a handle of a baseball bat. The end of it doesn't look pointy at all. It looks very dull and rounded. Like, how are you supposed to stab a vampire with that? Now, for those who are kind of familiar with the book or familiar with the original Salem's Lot, miniseries, movie, what have you, this movie, it does have some similarities. It follows the main basic story that you have in the book, in the miniseries. It does change some things towards the end. So the back half, it does have a different ending than the original miniseries. It kind of does its own thing, which I like out of remakes. I don't want a direct, beat by beat remake where it's just following the same story and exactly how it's going to end. I like when remakes kind of do their own thing, as far as it doesn't, tread too far from the source material or, ruin some of the characters or motivations from the source material. And I liked the finale in this one as a whole, like the set piece for it. I think it did something very interesting as far as the showdown between the main characters and the other vampires. I don't think the main showdown with the head vampire Nosferatu, I don't think that showdown was good by any means. I think they definitely could have went back to the drawing board on that one or extended it a little bit longer, because it's very underwhelming and kind of anticlimactic. But I think the setup and the basic third act structure of it, I think, was decent. I think it was interesting what they did. It was very creative of how they went about it. And for those who are familiar with the original 1979 movie miniseries or whatever, it does have a couple of those, familiar scenes from the original one, like you see in the trailer of, the boy floating up in front of the window, trying to get his buddy to invite him inside and everything. I wouldn't say it's nearly as creepy as the original, but it is kind of effective. It's kind of creepy in its own way. I think, like I mentioned, the kind of direction they went with the cinematography and the look of it and kind of the filter on it, and just kind of like, it seemed like it was CG fog in a way. It seemed like they didn't even really use like real fog. I don't know. It kind of takes you out of it. It just seems very modern horror in a way. It seems very like Blumhouse horror in a way, just like cheesy, what you would expect out of a horror movie nowadays, just mostly CG type shit, not a lot of practical effects, very mediocre, characters, dumbed down plot, even though it follows the main plot of the books and of the book and the original movie. I don't think it goes nearly as far with it, maybe because they had to cut down the time of it to 2 hours. So it's a lot easier to digest. But I mean, with Salem's Lot, even though I didn't read the book, I feel like it works better as a miniseries. And for some reason, I don't understand why HBO or Max didn't make like a limited time, series out of Salem's Lot. Like, make like an 8 episode miniseries out of it or something. Then you could have gotten all of the character development out of all these characters, and you really could have went the whole way with it, and could have really developed Stephen King novel as a complete mini series. And I'm not saying you have to do it as a two-part, just make it like a 6 episode or 8 episode thing, and I think it would have been great. And then you could have maybe went on the sequels, because I know there's the sequels to the book as well. But overall, like I mentioned, I think it's a good introductory horror movie for new fans of horror, or people that are just wanting to get into horror movies. It's nothing too scary, nothing too crazy, gory, or gnarly, or anything like that. I think it fits well for someone that's just kind of getting into the horror scene, and it's not too scary by any means. As far as Salem's Lot goes, I think you're better sticking with the original 1979 Tobe Hooper directed version of it, just because of how it's paced, some of the creepiness in there, the practical effects. I think it has a lot more going for it than this one does. This one just feels like a very by the numbers, mediocre, run of the mill horror movie. And I hate to say it, but I mean, looking at the director's credits, I mean, you kind of can expect that out of this type of movie, and I expect that out of the director at the time. And I mean, I'm sure he's a nice dude, but I mean, it just seems like he has a track record as of right now, just making some mediocre shit. As far as overall opinion of this movie, I think it was decently shot. I think the cinematography was good. I think the set design and the town looked great. It felt very lived in. But I think like a couple of the characters, they really needed some work and some writing to them to help them, be a little bit more relatable and a little bit more likable. I think there could have been a lot better scares, or a lot of, better setup for scares, and a lot more tension that could have been built by making the movie a little bit darker. I think this movie definitely has its audience for some people, but for the longtime horror fans that are looking for something scary or spooky and during spooky season, I don't think this is it. I think this is a miss. I like, out of a buy it, rent it, or miss it, I'm gonna say miss this one, man. I mean, it's not to say it's a bad movie by any means. I mean, I don't think it's a terrible movie or a bad movie. I just think it's very mid, as the kids say nowadays. I definitely don't recommend going check this one out, especially if you're familiar with the original Salem's Lot. Go check that one out instead. If you're not familiar with Salem's Lot, go check out the original anyway. Why not? But yeah, that's the review for this week. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Go check us out on Twitter and Instagram at Cinema Trip Reviews. Also, drop in and leave us a good review wherever you get your podcast. Leave us a 5-star review if you can. That really gets our podcast out there to a lot more people. Brings a lot more viewers into the show, and helps us out on the channel. And I really appreciate that. And I also really appreciate everybody that tunes in and checks us out on a weekly basis. We have a lot more in store here through our Halloween Spooktacular Horror Month. I'm going to be reviewing Terrifier 3 next week, because that drops this weekend. I am super stoked for that one. That's been on my most anticipated movies of the year list. So I'm going to be going into that one. And then we got some more surprises as the rest of the month, unfolds. Check out the store, by the way, in the links below. Get you a nice Cinema Trip Reviews Halloween 78 spooky t-shirt. There's a lot of other stuff on there. There's a little bit of everything for everybody out there. So make sure to check out the store. And make sure to tell your friends about the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Tell everybody that you can. And I'll see everybody next week.